The Vanderbilt family reunion of 1973 had 120 people in attendance, descendants of the man who had been, just 96 years earlier, the single wealthiest individual in the United States. Cornelius Vanderbilt had died, holding more personal fortune than the entire United States Treasury. His son doubled it. And by that room in 1973, not a single millionaire among them. Most people hear that story and reach for the obvious explanation. Lavish spending. The 70-room cottages in Newport. The marble houses. The yachts. And those things are true. But they are not the explanation. They are the symptom of something that was already broken. Something that broke in a room no one was watching. At a moment that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. And what actually separates the families that stayed rich across 5 generations from the families that didn't is not the asset class they chose. It is not their estate planning documents, their tax strategy, or their investment returns. Those things matter at the margin. The thing that determined everything was something that almost no financial education names. And it is something that applies just as directly to a family with $50,000 saved as to one with $50 million. 4 historical families. 3 of them broke the pattern. One of them broke it so completely that even a government seizure of their bank couldn't stop them. Here is what those 3 knew that the Vanderbilts didn't. Start with the Fuggers of Augsburg. If you have never heard of them, that is itself part of the story. In the early 16th century, on Jakob Fugger, the rich controlled wealth estimated at roughly 2% of the entire GDP of Europe. Modern scholars put the figure somewhere around $400 billion in today's terms. He was, by most measures, the wealthiest private individual in recorded history. Richer than anyone alive today in purchasing power terms, achieved without a central bank printing his currency into existence, or a stock market multiplying paper claims. His family had started as weavers. 3 generations later, they were financing the election of Holy Roman emperors. Jakob Fugger once wrote to Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe, demanding repayment of a debt. Not politely, demanding it. But here's the thing about the Fuggers that the list of what they owned does not capture. Their wealth was concentrated in one relationship: the Habsburgs, the Spanish crown, the mining leases those sovereigns controlled. When Philip II of Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, and again in 1560, and again in 1575, the Fugger fortune cracked at its foundation. 3 sovereign defaults in less than 20 years. The loans didn't just fail to be repaid. The leases on the silver mines were revoked. Cargoes already in transit were confiscated. The instrument that had created the fortune was turned against it. The descendants of Jakob Fugger didn't starve. The family had, wisely, converted enormous portions of their financial wealth into land and estates throughout Swabia. Anton Fugger, who led the firm after Jakob's death, had made that conversion almost compulsively, turning financial assets into soil, into forests, into permanent holdings that no sovereign bankruptcy could dissolve. And those land holdings survived. The Fuggerei in Augsburg, the world's oldest social housing complex, still operating today, still charging residents about €1 per year in annual rent, was built with an endowment invested almost entirely in land and forestry. 500 years later, the foundation owns thousands of hectares of forest. That piece of the fortune outlasted everything else. But the banking operation, the engine that had made the family extraordinary, collapsed. And the question the Fugger story raises is sharper than it looks. The land survived. The Fuggerei survived. But the capacity to generate new wealth from scratch? Gone by the mid-17th century. The family became noble landowners, comfortable, significant. Not the family they had been. Something was preserved, but something more important was lost. What you're watching in every one of these cases is a version of the same invisible moment. The first time the next generation handles the financial machine alone, not inherits money, handles the machine. Jakob Fugger managed the Habsburg relationship himself, personally, until he died. Anton Fugger managed it until his health failed, and then his sons and nephews, by his own recorded description, showed little interest in business. The machine ran on without the people who understood how it worked. That gap between inheriting assets and inheriting the capacity to steward them is the hinge point in every single one of these stories. Keep watching for that hinge. It appears in every case. Sometimes you can see it, and sometimes it's only visible in retrospect. Now look at the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the son of a Staten Island ferryman. He built the railroad empire through personal mastery, brutal negotiation, intimate knowledge of every route, every deal, every competitor. He understood the machine at a molecular level. His son William Henry inherited both the fortune and enough of his father's instincts to double it. But Cornelius had one instruction: the fortune should pass intact to a single heir. William Henry ignored it. He divided the estate among multiple sons. Not a bad decision on its own. But what he didn't divide, along with it, was any framework for what the money was for, how it should be governed, what decisions required consensus, and what kind of person each heir needed to become before touching it. And the third generation, Cornelius's grandsons, built the breakers in Newport, the 70-room cottage modeled on an Italian Renaissance palazzo. They built Marble House. They built 640 Fifth Avenue. They built a 154-room private residence, the largest in New York. They married their daughters to European dukes, trading American dollars for British titles. One of those daughters, Consuelo, wept on her wedding day, a marriage her mother had arranged to purchase aristocratic prestige. The money was converting itself into status symbols faster than the underlying businesses could replenish it. And here is what the textbooks miss. The Vanderbilt Railroad, the New York Central, was not obviously a dying business in the 1880s or even the 1900s. Our railroads carried the American economy for decades after the Vanderbilt fortune began its decline. The problem wasn't the industry. The problem was that the people responsible for managing the family's relationship with that industry were too busy building palaces. The machine kept running. No one was learning how it worked. By the time cars and planes began to genuinely threaten the railroad model, the Vanderbilts no longer had anyone in the family who understood the machine well enough to adapt it. By 1973, at that family reunion, the result was 120 people who had consumed a legacy rather than stewarded one. This is the pattern. Not spending, not investment returns. The machine runs, the heirs consume, the heirs. And the generation that was never taught to understand the machine eventually stands in a room that used to mean something. What is worth noting is that different crises hit these families differently. The Fuggers lost their fortune to sovereign default, a catastrophic, concentrated failure. The Vanderbilts diluted theirs across decades of comfortable consumption. These are not the same experience. One was a sudden event that could theoretically have been survived with different counterparty decisions. The other was a long, slow erosion that no single person was responsible for, and no single decision could have reversed. Severity, speed, and reversibility vary enormously across these stories. What they share is not the mechanism of failure, but the upstream condition that made failure possible. Now the Rockefellers. John D. R. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a near monopoly controlling roughly 90% of American refining capacity by the late 19th century. By the time of his death in 1937, His personal fortune was somewhere in the range of $1.4 billion, which some scholars estimate at several hundred billion in today's purchasing power. The Supreme Court had broken Standard Oil into 34 separate companies in 1911. Those companies became ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others. The breakup that was supposed to destroy the Rockefeller fortune may have actually increased it by creating multiple independent companies that each appreciated separately. But that is not what preserved the fortune across 5 generations. Here is the reversal that matters. The Rockefellers did not start with trusts, as they started with education. John D. Rockefeller began teaching his children the principles of financial stewardship before they could read. He gave them small allowances with explicit rules. Save a portion, give a portion, earn more through small tasks. He kept ledgers of every transaction and required the children to keep ledgers too. The point was not discipline for its own sake. The point was that he was teaching them to understand the machine while it was still small enough to be understood. By the time they were adults, the principles were already built in. The trusts came later. The family office, what became the model for modern family wealth management, came later. But it was built on a foundation of people who had been trained to be stewards before they were positioned as heirs. David Rockefeller Jr. has described the family's approach in terms that sound almost counterintuitive. The goal was never to produce people who managed money well. The goal was to produce people who understood why the money existed and what responsibilities came with it. The asset wasn't the trust. The asset was the framework that made the trust behave correctly. Today, the Rockefeller fortune, distributed across hundreds of descendants and multiple charitable trusts, is estimated at around $10 billion collectively. Not the original sum. Not even close. But 5 generations in, with hundreds of people dividing the inheritance, the name still represents genuine, functioning wealth. That is not an accident of asset allocation. That is a governance structure that survived the transition from one generation to the next, and then survived it again, and then again, and then there is the case that makes everything else look manageable. In 1982, the socialist French government of François Mitterrand nationalized 36 banks. Banque Rothschild, the Paris operation that had been operating since 1812, 170 years of accumulated institutional knowledge, client relationships, deal flow, and reputation, was seized, renamed, stripped of the family's ability to use their own name in banking for 4 years. By 1980, by most measures, a 2,000-person operation with an annual turnover equivalent to $5 billion. David de Rothschild was 39 years old. He stayed. He rebuilt. 3 employees, under $1 million in capital, not even allowed to use the family name. And within 2 decades, as the Paris operation had become one of the leading advisory and merger practices in European investment banking. The Rothschild family today manages over 124 billion euros in assets under their wealth management division alone. What survived the nationalization? Not the assets. Those were seized. Not the client relationships in their legal form. Those were taken too. What survived was something the French government could not confiscate. It was the family's understanding of what they were, what they did, and why they did it. The institutional memory. The identity. The clarity about what the machine was for, and how to rebuild it from scratch when the physical apparatus was gone. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, one of the founding sons, had written something that the family apparently took seriously across every subsequent generation. It takes boldness and caution to make a great fortune, and when you have it, it requires 10 times as much wit to keep it. That formulation, the 10 times multiplier on the wit required for preservation, is not a marketing line. It is a description of an operating principle. Every generation of Rothschilds was trained not just to inherit the business, but to understand it, to be willing to rebuild it if necessary, and to regard the family's financial identity as something more durable than any specific asset. In 1983, with 3 employees and $1 million in capital, David de Rothschild effectively became the first generation again. He had to build from almost nothing, and he had the tools to do it, because the family had been producing people with those tools for 2 centuries. The people who rebuilt fastest were not the ones with the most assets. They were the ones who understood why they were there. There is a modern mirror to all of this that is worth sitting with. The largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history is currently underway. Baby boomers and the silent generation are expected to transfer somewhere around $84 trillion to their children and grandchildren by 2045. Roughly $84 trillion flowing into the hands of people who, in most cases, have never had to build what they are about to receive. Research on what happens to that money is uncomfortable. About 70% of family wealth disappears by the 2nd generation, and 90% by the 3rd. A landmark study from Citi Private Bank found that financial and legal mistakes, the bad estate planning, the poorly timed investments, the tax errors, account for roughly 3% of wealth transfer failures. 3%. The other 97% fails because of family dynamics. 60% from communication breakdowns and eroded trust within the family. 25% from heirs who were simply never prepared. The surface problem everyone addresses is the asset allocation question. Which trust structure? Which tax strategy? Which investment vehicle? Those questions matter. But they are the 3%. The 97% is the conversation that didn't happen at the dinner table, the child who never saw a ledger, or the heir who knew the number in the account, but not the work that created it, the generation that became consumers of the legacy rather than stewards of it. The Vanderbilt 3rd generation was not stupid. They were not lazy. Many of them were talented in art, in sport, in social life. The issue, as one historian put it, was that the family had stopped being an enterprise and become a clientele. They consumed their inheritance rather than creating new value. And no trust document, no matter how cleverly structured, can force the next generation to understand the machine. That understanding has to be built before the transfer. It has to be built in the years when the money is still abstract, when the stakes are small enough to learn from mistakes, when the person handling the ledger is doing it because they were taught to, not because they have to. The Rockefellers understood this. The Rothschilds, in a different way, understood it too. What they built was not primarily a financial structure. It was a transmissible identity, a set of values, principles, and orientations toward money that could survive partition, nationalization, and sovereign default, because those things lived in people rather than in legal documents. The families who kept their wealth across 5 generations kept it because each generation produced at least some people who understood the machine, who were trained to steward, not just to spend, who regarded themselves as temporary holders of something that existed across time, not as owners of an inheritance. The Fuggerei still charges €1 a year in rent. 500 years after Jakob Fugger endowed it, much the forests he purchased are still generating income, still funding that housing, still carrying the name. The financial empire is gone, but the part of the wealth that was invested in something that could outlast any individual decision, that survived everything. Here is the question worth sitting with. Of the assets you are building or have already built, how many of them depend on a legal institution to honor a promise before they have value? And how many of them would still function if that institution changed its mind? And separately, If you disappeared tomorrow, does the next person in your family who would touch your money know why it exists? Not where it is, but why? That is the question the Vanderbilt third generation couldn't answer. It is the question the Rothschild third generation could answer, even with 3 employees and a seized bank. The gap between those two answers is the century-long wealth formula. If this one changed the way you think about what you're building, like and subscribe. The next piece looks at what happened to families who got the governance right, but chose the wrong assets for the era they were living in. It changes how this one reads. Comment below the word that comes to mind when you think about the moment your family last talked honestly about money. One word. That word tells you more about your financial future than your portfolio allocation does.